Since your program contains a brief sketch of Mr. Buruma's work, CV, and awards, I thought that I'd share a complimentary description of his latest work of personal history by none other than Philip Roth, because a complimentary description by Philip Roth is high and rare praise. Roth writes, "Their Promised Land is a carefully and admirably written, highly readable work of social history, told charmingly in a most intimate way, through a close perusal of family correspondence. Buruma writes of British-born Jews of the upper middle class with a great sympathetic perspicacity and sweetness. These are, after all, his grandparents who are his subject. And most revealingly, he traces with precision the effect on their lives of being Jews of German origin in their beloved England during the 2 world wars." It's a pleasure to have him. Please welcome Ian Buruma.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming and for that kind introduction. I should thank Philip Roth too, I suppose. When thinking of this book, I was faced with 2 problems, one ethical one and one sort of literary, technical one. The ethical one was that my grandparents, and particularly my grandmother, was a very private person. And she probably would have been horrified to know that anybody ever read their letters. Indeed, when her father died and left a lot of letters, she burnt them all because she thought it would be rude for people to read somebody else's private correspondence, which was a pity, since her father was an immigrant from Germany in the 1880s, and it would have been fascinating to read what he had to say, but that's the way she felt, and she probably would have felt that way about her own letters. On the other hand, neither she nor my grandfather could bear to throw any of their letters away, so they kept every single one of them. And perhaps somewhere there's a sort of secret desire that somebody might sort of notice their traces after they're gone. So there is an ethical dilemma there, but I don't think that I've betrayed them, because I've written this. Close to them, and they died in the 1980s, so I knew them very well. And the other is the hat of the historian. And the early letters are now literally 100 years old, and I thought that it's now old enough, or it's a long time ago enough that it can be now treated as a historical document. And a correspondence of this kind between 2 people that goes from the first time they met all the way until their old age, even though I stopped, for the purposes of this book, stopped it at the end of World War II in 1945, is very, very rare, especially, of course, in our age of the email. Emails are not written to last forever, and so a correspondence like this is a rare enough document that I felt it deserved a public airing. The other problem was a more literary one, which is that they had an extremely loving marriage until the very end. They adored each other, which is a problem if you're going to write a book about people. It's much easier if there is a murder or a terrible divorce or a betrayal of some kind or some deep and bloody secret. There was none of that. I mean, they adored one another, and I think set a bar that was perhaps too high for following generations to come up to. But perhaps a loving marriage of that kind is also rare enough that it becomes a kind of dramatic instance in itself. Now, what made me write this book? Everybody is interested, or most people are interested in their own families. It seems extremely arrogant to assume that other people would be just as interested. And I think it comes, like most books, that an author is interested enough in to be able to sustain an interest and write them. It's autobiographical. My great-grandparents influenced me a great deal. My mother, who was born and grew up in England, married a Dutchman, my father. They met on top of Mount Annecy in France when she was studying in Geneva and he was a young lawyer. And so I grew up in The Hague in Holland. And I always thought of my mother's family as being much more glamorous than my father's family. The Hague I always thought was a rather dowdy town, and there was no doubt in my mind that I would get out of there as quickly as I could. And my mother's family was theatrical. They lived a grander life. There were one of my aunts was an actress. My uncle became a famous filmmaker. We had opera singers in the family, not a very successful one, but nonetheless they were there. So that it had an air of enormous glamour to me. And I saw, on holidays that I spent with my grandparents, I sort of looked at England through their eyes. So I idealized not only them and my family, but I idealized England as well. And this was partly because they never left any doubt in anybody's mind of the superiority of the country of their birth. From a very early age, I always felt that somehow England was better than the country I grew up in, and so on. Only later did I realize that this rosy view of England was not only questionable, but came from a more complicated psychology to do with my grandparents themselves, and that they were the children of immigrants, and they themselves rather idealized the country of their birth for various reasons that the book goes into. Three of my great-grandparents, my two great-grandfathers and one great-grandmother, came from Germany, from Kassel and Frankfurt, in the late 19th century, not because they were persecuted, but because there were better job offers in London. My two grandfathers became stockbrokers in the city of London. One was very good at it, was known as Richard the 13th because he could apparently squeeze 13 pennies out of a pound. The other one was much less good at it and much preferred listening to Brahms and so on than he did dealing in stocks. So, and one great-grandmother was born in Manchester, but she was also from a German-Jewish family. And so they were Anglo-Jews, my grandparents, both born in London, but with many of the characteristics, really, of the kind of family they came from, the background they came from, which was German-Jewish. In some ways, the German-Jewish attitudes were transformed transferred to their sort of Anglo-Jewishness. And by that I mean that the German side of the family in my great-grandparents' time was already very assimilated, except that they were assimilated as Germans. And I have a photograph of one of my great-grandfathers in a Prussian uniform with a sort of Kaiser moustache. And the family story is that one day he asked a friend of his in the army why he wasn't getting promoted beyond a certain rank, and he was told, "But don't you know you're a Jew?" And that was the moment that he decided to move. I think it's probably a slightly apocryphal story, but it says something about where they came from. And they were very, very German. And one of the great-grandfathers was Orthodox, and the other was entirely secular. The Orthodox one, my grandfather's father, was also the great fan of Richard Wagner's music, which sounds like a weird contradiction. After all, Wagner was known as a ferocious anti-Semite. In fact, it is perhaps not entirely a contradiction. I have a theory about this. I think that Wagner had many Jewish admirers in Germany and outside Germany still, but certainly in Germany in the 19th century, because his kind of quasi-religious celebration of Germanness in Bayreuth was a way for assimilated German Jews to celebrate their own sense of being German without having to convert to Christianity. And so this sort of very German, quasi-religious German feeling appealed to German Jews of this class that my great-grandparents came from, because it allowed them to assimilate in a way without converting. And I would say that the most Jewish characteristics of my grandparents that was passed on was not an overtly Jewish tradition. It wasn't food, it wasn't celebrating Passover and so on, although they did go to the so-called liberal Jewish synagogue, which is the Reformed synagogue here, particularly towards the end of their lives. But they were not religious, they were not traditional. My uncles were not even bar mitzvahed, as far as I know. But there was an extraordinary family closeness, and there was the cult of classical music. And this, I think, again, was very much inherited from their sort of German Jewish background. And music was sort of the highest thing to aspire to, hence also the defense of Wagner. And in the Second World War, both my grandparents were ferociously anti-German for very obvious reasons. But who was there when, at the first Bayreuth Festspiele, when it opened up, after having been so deeply tainted by Hitler's enthusiasm for Bayreuth and Wagner's own attitudes, my family, because music was trumped everything, really. And so I think that's the background they came from, which was very much assimilated, very much adapting to the culture and the country that they grew up in. Now, it's interesting in reading the letters to look at the differences between their attitudes in World War I and World War II towards their own German background. World War I in Britain, people were more anti-German, really, than in World War II. In World War II, the enemies were the Nazis. I mean, the Nazis were also Germans, but the Nazis were the sort of the real focus of people's hostility. In World War I, there were no Nazis. It was the Hun, the Boche, the German, and so on, which actually annoyed my grandparents rather, because they were still very close to that culture. Their parents were still quite German, even though they were British citizens. In the Second World War, they were very anti-German themselves, and at the same time, and this complicates their feelings, and this comes across in the letters, and I think it tells you again a lot about how complicated the attitudes of that particular assimilated milieu could be. So they were very anti-German, loathed everything to do with Germany, and yet wanted to dissociate themselves. They didn't want to be seen themselves as refugees in any shape or form. I mean, they wanted to be British. And so even though in 1938, months before the Kristallnacht, which prompted many people, especially Jews in Britain, but also Quakers and others, to help try and rescue German children on the so-called Kindertransport from Germany to get them out at the last minute, which the British government allowed them to do, but only on the condition that these refugees, would be privately sponsored and would leave their parents behind, so they could only come as orphans. In any case, my grandparents showed solidarity when it mattered, and before the Kristallnacht in 1938 had decided to rescue 12 children from Berlin and took them into the family and kept up with them for the rest of their lives. So while they did that and were very aware of relatives who were in one way or another the victims of Nazism, they also wanted to be seen first and foremost as British. So there's an extraordinary letter in 1940, just after Dunkirk, written by my grandmother to my grandfather when he was in Narvik as an army doctor with the Navy. And she says, "Isn't it marvelous how our men, in every generation, our men pluck victory from defeat? It reminds me of the charge of the Light Brigade." And you wouldn't think from this letter that her parents were both born in Germany. But that's the way they wanted to see themselves. She was also, when in the letters, never to them directly, I don't think, but in the letters she complains that some of these refugee children, I mean, who were not even teenagers at the time, went de-Germanizing quickly enough, and they still had the manners of the typical Bosch and that kind of thing. And so it shows, I think, how mixed their feelings were. Now, why did they decide, and this is a slight mystery, to rescue these children before other people did the same thing? And there are hints in the letters why they did it. And I think it has something to do with anti-Semitism in Britain, in that my grandparents were much too proud to complain about anti-Semitism. I think they felt that they felt that they should be above that sort of thing. They knew probably quite well what kind of people to dodge and so on. They didn't complain about it very much. It must have been there, but they didn't complain about it. They wanted to be patriotic and British, but they couldn't get around it either. And my grandfather, after having studied medicine in Cambridge, was looking desperately in the 1920s for a permanent position at a hospital as a physician in London, and ran into this problem. And in 1938, he tried to get a job at St. Thomas's and was turned down, and in a letter to my grandmother he says, "It's the old problem. The job is not going to be mine at any price." And he himself said that this prompted him to actively get involved in rescuing children from Nazi Germany. And I think it sharpened his sense of the dangers of anti-Semitism, and he wanted to help people who were in even much greater danger than he himself was. Now, I quote in the book an Israeli philosopher who was born in Uruguay, who is Orthodox by religion, called Moshe Halbertal. And he once said to me, which impressed me, he said, there are closeted Jews and there are assimilated Jews. And he disapproved of the former, and he could live with the latter. Now, the question in my mind, reading my grandparents' letters, was very much where they belonged. Were they closeted, were they assimilated? I think it's true to say that they were more assimilated than closeted. They never denied anything. They never hid anything. They were always open about their background, but their attitude was that they shouldn't make too much of a fuss about it, lest other people would be tempted to do so. So they did not wear it as a great badge or anything like that, but they never denied anything. Now, I think it's also true to say, reading the letters, that my grandmother felt more, or tended to feel more embarrassed, had more anxiety about sticking out, about not fitting in, about people disapproving of her and so on, than my grandfather did, who was much more easygoing. And I think it also had something to do with their backgrounds, in that my grandfather, who, having grown up in an Orthodox family, and then becoming very lapsed, there was nothing left of that by the time I knew him, but at least he knew what it was all about. Whereas my grandmother never really grew up with any kind of Jewish tradition, and certainly not a religious one. And so I think in her mind, it was never quite clear to her what differentiated her from others around her, except that she was seen as different, which I think made her slightly less comfortable with coming from a Jewish background than my grandfather. Now, from a modern multiculturalist point of view, it could be said that people of the kind of class that my grandparents came from were in denial, that kind of assimilationism in some ways is a denial of your real identity and so on. This was a fashionable way of thinking, which has become slightly less so now because of the debates going on about Muslims and terrorism and all that sort of thing. But it was certainly a fashionable way of thinking not very long ago. I am skeptical about this attitude, about multiculturalism as an ideology, the idea that you have to somehow live out a clear identity that is different from others and so on. Because I think it should be a matter of choice, but I also think in the case of people who are assimilated, like my grandparents, their identity really was British and nothing else. More recently, it's become fashionable to reject multiculturalism and to feel that immigrants, children of immigrants, should, as is often said, share our values. They should show that they believe in the same things, and so on and so forth. Again, I'm a little skeptical about that as well, because I think people should be accepted as fellow citizens and so on, whether they share all our values or not. And in any case, any society has many conflicting values, and no society is monolithic. I also think that when people discuss immigration, integration, assimilation, and so on, what is often missing, also in the debates on the problems faced by Muslims in the West, is the element of the aspect of class. It's true to say, probably, it's not true that religion is something that is only appeals to the poor and the less educated classes. That would be an arrogant attitude, and it isn't true. It's certainly part of a certain kind of snobbery that is prevalent amongst the sort of upper middle class children and grandchildren of immigrants. And one of the disputes or rifts between in Jewish history in Europe and in the United States, of course, is between the German Jews, the kind of background that my grandparents came from, and more traditional, more religious Jews from Eastern Europe. And it's certainly true that the German Jews often look down on more traditional, more religious Jews from Eastern Europe, as though it was a sign of being low rent. So I think that's clearly not to be condoned, but I think it is true that the more educated, the more prosperous, the less traditional and the less religious people tend to be, and the more assimilated they tend to be. And I think that's true of all immigrants and the children of immigrants. And one should be very aware of this, in the sense that people who are more vulnerable, and not necessarily poorer, but more vulnerable, tend to need tradition and religion more, because it's often the only thing that gives them a sense of being anchored in a community and having a certain dignity. Now, my own attitude, which writing this book and thinking about these things, is different from my grandparents. In a sense, the book, of course, is a memoir, because thinking about my own family is also a way of thinking about myself. I grew up with parents from different cultures and different nationalities at a time that it wasn't all that usual in Europe. Now, of course, it's become commonplace. And this, I think, has given me a kind of fascination for cultural difference, and for the different ways that people see themselves in the world and so on, and perhaps a certain sensitivity to it. And I think every book I've written has something to do with this, or comes round to this topic. And I'm sometimes asked, what do I feel? Am I Dutch? Am I British? What kind of mixture is it really? And I suppose the only proper answer to that is that I'm both, and it depends. And I'm far from unique in this, and it depends really on where I am and who I'm talking to, and so on, which feeling prevails. Now, I'll conclude with this. Writing about my grandparents and writing about the way they saw their place in the world made me very aware that I was in many ways luckier than they were. And they were, of course, luckier than many others who are in much less fortunate circumstances, especially on the continent of Europe at the time. But I could more or less pick and choose who I wanted to be. I could be both British and Dutch. I could spend my 20s in Japan and travel in the Far East and so on, and adopt all kinds of identities without it getting me into any kind of trouble. I didn't have my grandmother's anxieties, but then I lived in a different time. And so it was not difficult for me to resist the temptation to judge my grandparents when I was writing this book. And I refused to do so, and I wrote it really as a labor of love. And I think perhaps that excuses my ethical lapse that I started this talk with in the beginning of possibly posthumously betraying their trust and make their lives public. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Was there reference at any point in your grandparents' correspondence to the Zionist movement? I mean, I would imagine from the way you described them that although they weren't greatly interested in the religious aspect of their Jewish heritage, they still were knowledgeable about the world, and that was progressing even before the Nazi threat. So that's my number one question. My number two question is a quick and easy one. You didn't say whether your father was Jewish. You said he was Dutch. So I assumed he was Jewish. And then, as an aside, I want to advise you, when you get a chance, and whoever else is interested, have a look at the web. The new skyline of dowdy old The Hague, has a very interesting look to it. The new high-rises, they look very similar, like a play on the pre-existing fabric of the townscape. It's just unusual, and I was surprised.
Well, okay, no, there are no real references to Zionism. I don't think they were unsympathetic, but I don't think that they were ever felt any real attraction to it because they were so firmly British. And this, of course, already was a factor when Theodor Herzl was going around London and Paris and so on, trying to get Anglo-Jews and others to support the Zionist movement. In Britain at the time, he had far easier time getting support from Anglican priests and so on, who believed in, the chosen people being able to go back to the Holy Land and all that. Whereas Jews who were prosperous and well settled in Britain often found him a nuisance because he was rocking the boat and it was no skin off their nose and all that. And I don't think my grandparents perhaps felt that strongly about it, but it didn't preoccupy them much. I know that they visited Israel, and I also know that my grandfather in World War I was in Palestine when Jerusalem was taken and was very moved by this. But apart from that, I think they belonged to the school that felt that Jews ought to be part of the countries in which they were born and raised, and not to look for life elsewhere. But then, of course, they were in a position, a comfortable enough position to be able to do so, unlike most of Theodor Herzl's early supporters who desperately needed to get out. My father was not Jewish. My grandfather, my father's father, was a Mennonite minister, and the Mennonites in Holland are very different from the Mennonites here. Here we associate them with long beards and black suits and so on, which was an embarrassment to my grandfather in Holland when they would occasionally come to visit because they had very little in common. The Mennonites in Holland are the most liberal, ecumenical Protestants. And my father reacted to his upbringing in the end in the way that children of men of the cloth often do, by becoming an atheist. So my mother was a secular Jew who knew very little about Judaism. My father was an atheist, and the only thing that perhaps trickled down through the generations was a slight prejudice against Catholics. But that's about all.
Ed?
Ian, I'm slow to this. I'm going to catch up with the book, and I look forward to it. But one of the things that sort of brought me into it was the idea of a lifelong writing to each other.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a sense of what were the circumstances that would have them away from each other. Most of us, the idea of a couple writing is sort of intriguing to me. Most of us kind of just go home to our partner and don't. So could you just riff on that?
Well, it begins in 1915, and my grandfather was then still at school, but in the typical way of children of immigrants, wanted to show his patriotism by volunteering immediately when he was needed. And this was a habit that he kept up for the rest of his life. Every time there was a crisis, he would volunteer for the army, even though he was never a professional soldier. I think it went all the way up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but when he was already in his 60s and he had to be politely told that, Dr. Schlesinger, I think you've shown that you've done your bit for the country and you can now retire. So this is when it begins, and he volunteers. He was a stretcher bearer, and he was worried in 1915 when he's in an army camp, and that's when the first letters appear, that he wasn't being sent to the front quickly enough, and he thought it might be his German name. And little did he know that he very soon would be a stretcher bearer in the Battle of the Somme, and was witness to some of the most horrific things that happened in the 20th century. He never talked about it. But during that time, of course, they were apart. Most of the letters, it must be said, are from World War II. There are letters when my grandmother would visit her family in Kassel, which are very interesting because they go all the way up to 1931, 32 even. And it's very interesting to see how much the rise of Nazism affected the attitudes and the lives of well-to-do Jews in Germany at the time. And the answer is that they kept it at an arm's length for an awful long time, hoping it would just blow over. But in World War II, my grandfather, again, of course, volunteered and ended up as an army doctor in India for 3 years. And didn't see his wife, who then had to cope with 5 children and 2 grandmothers and the 12 children they'd rescued from Berlin, had to cope on her own. And they knew that every letter they wrote would take at least a month to get to the other side, if it got there at all. Nonetheless, they wrote almost every day. And so you rarely get into their heads reading those letters, in a way one, of course, almost never does with one's parents or grandparents. I think on that note, I think it's probably would be more embarrassing to read intimate details about your own parents than about your grandparents. So I never found it awkward, but that's because there's slightly more distance. So that's the story of the letters. Now, there were letters after the war when they went on trips and that kind of thing separately, but I wanted the symmetry of the beginning of World War I and the end of World War II.
Thank you for your special family story. I can understand why you wrote about your grandparents. They sound like very special people. And I'm curious, when you said they adored each other, I'm trying to get a feel for what characteristics a grandson would observe about his grandparents to have him say they adored each other.
Well, they were very open about this. I mean, even though it's often said that British people are very sort of reticent and hide their feelings and so on, but they didn't hide their feelings about one another. And my grandmother would always hold up my grandfather as a sort of an example of the ideal character and somebody we should emulate and so on. He made a point of, when he was in his dotage and his mind was already beginning to wander, but still he said he would thank her every day for the fact that she'd been his wife. And so they were almost Victorian in this slightly sentimental way in expressing their feelings about each other. So this was never hidden. And I do think it's wonderful and heartwarming and all that. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily make life easier for the offspring, because there is an element of perhaps being slightly excluded too, of these parents who are so in love with one another that the rest of the world recedes a little bit. And there is again, they were aware of it, because in some of the letters in World War II, my grandmother does say, "I wish I could love my children as much as I love you," and so on. And I think the children sensed that, which may explain some of our failures in going down to the grandchildren in our own lives. But
yeah, I'm interested in the process of how the book came about. Had you read the letters when they were alive, or did you find them and start reading them after they had died, and then found that there was a story in there and within the letter, and start documenting it from what you had read?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure anymore how much I knew about the letters before I knew about them. One forgets these things. It's like one of the stock questions you always get when you've written a book is, what was the biggest surprise, or what did you learn? And of course you forget what you didn't know. So I think I must have known that there were letters. I also know that they kept everything. My uncle, their eldest son, to whom I was also very close, the film director, John Schlesinger, had a house in the country in England. And that's where all the family archives were kept. And it was after they died that I first read some of these letters. And it was when I was writing a book about European Anglomania. And I used some of the letters, specifically my grandmother's most patriotic effusions in World War II. And then I thought, reading those letters, there is a bigger story here. Because it's so extraordinary it's almost like a novel in letters. It's so extraordinary to have the lives of two people that you can trace in their correspondence all the way through. And there were so many aspects to it that went beyond the personal interest one might find in one's own family, because it told you a lot about sexual attitudes, about class, about what it was like to live in world wars if you were not a famous general or a resistant hero, but an ordinary person, how it affected family life and so on. So I did, and I wrote that book, let me think, in the late 1990s. And I remember thinking then I should do something with this. But I didn't quite know how to do it. And at one point I thought, well, maybe use them for a novel, but I thought, well, but that's sort of a waste of wonderful material. It's too interesting just to mine for fiction. And the difficulty then was, in figuring out how to write the book, was how to find the right balance between their voices and mine. And I didn't want to hog the stage by being too much of a commentator. On the other hand, you don't just want to quote endlessly from letters either. So it was that was really the tricky part in writing it.
I'm curious, are you diffident about reading into the letters publicly?
I'm sorry?
Are you diffident about reading any of the
No,
letters?
I'm not diffident at all. I read 2 letters on NPR this morning. And I also did the audiobook myself, which was a strange experience, it must be said. I mean, reading the letters of one's grandparents in the privacy of one's own study is one thing. Reading them in public, in the voices of your own grandparents, is not that I mimic the voices, but I mean, but reading their words is a slightly peculiar sensation. But no, I'm not diffident about it.
Yeah, gentleman on the aisle here.
Thank you. I can understand that doing research on your own family would be deeply meaningful to you, but what primary lesson would you think were you hoping a reader not from your family would draw from the reading about someone else's family?
Right. Well, there are various themes that I think do resonate. One is a family and how do families behave in times of crisis. And to give you one example, and this is not something that many families, thank goodness, face, but in 1940, when it was by no means sure that the Germans wouldn't prevail and invade Britain, the question arose what to do with the children, how to make sure that the family would be safe. And my grandmother writes in one of the letters, we have to believe that we will win, that the worst won't happen, and so on. However, being a Jewish family, it's obviously will be impossible to live here if the Germans take over. And they were faced with a dilemma, because on the one hand, she didn't want to be defeatist. Defeatist was for foreigners. As a British patriot, one has to believe in the ultimate victory. On the other hand, she had to take this possibility into account. And they had a debate, I think. Should they send the children to Canada, as some people did, risking the fact that they might never see their children again, or should they keep the family together whatever happens? And I think this is a deeply human dilemma that I think many people would be able to identify with. Another theme, I think, is how the children of immigrants cope with their sense of belonging, their sense of nationality, their sense of culture, and so on. And I think this is something that is a more burning issue than ever today. And so in that sense, I think it's not a model, but it makes you think about all these questions. And when I say it's not a model, I'm not saying that the way they conducted their lives was wrong either. But it brings up, it sharpens one's awareness of that issue. And there are other things too. But I did feel very strongly that the story would have a wider significance. Now, what is interesting is that your skepticism, if that is what it is, was shared by my own family, not by people who didn't know them at all and first read the book, like my editor and Philip Roth and others. It was my sisters and my father who said, "Well, nobody's going to be interested in this except we loved them, but why would anybody want to know?" and so on. And I think this is something that often happens when you write about family, loved ones, and so on. It's always a risky thing to do because everybody has a different view of those that they felt close to or loved, and you can very easily get into trouble with relatives, with family, with people who knew them, because for whatever reason they feel that you've got the wrong end of the stick. I don't think that happened, but your question was certainly in the minds of those who were most intimately involved.
Before we say goodnight, can you share a favorite story of yours about each of your grandparents, and maybe one about your uncle as well?
Well, the other theme in the book, which I tread on lightly, but it was very much there, is but what it's like to have a son who is clearly extremely gifted, but who was also, from a very early age, although they didn't quite recognize it, but was clearly homosexual. And so to have a budding artist who's also gay in the family in the 1920s and 30s is a fascinating thing. And so he was at what in Britain is called a public school, a boarding school. Was totally unsuited to it. He was hopeless at everything that a boarding school boy was supposed to be good at, like rugby and cricket and that kind of thing. And all he cared about was putting on family theatricals and applying makeup to my mother and getting dressed up in his mother's clothes and that kind of thing. And my grandmother particularly was deeply worried that he would come to nothing, that it would all be a disaster, and which is all strange for me to read because later, when he became a successful film director, he was sort of the great hero of our family that we all looked up to, and including my grandmother. who was very, very close to him. So, and also, it must be said, despite the fact that they were rather Victorian, and I'll tell you a story about that to illustrate it, they were rather Victorian in their attitudes. They were very accepting in the end of him, in that he was at Oxford as a student and had an unhappy love affair with another student, a man. And he went away for a while and came back. And this must have been in 1949 or 1950, and my grandmother made it very clear to him that she accepted the way he was and said, I hope you've got over Alan, I think was his name, which is pretty extraordinary if you consider that at the time it was still a crime to be homosexual. So they were totally accepting of that. Now, how Victorian my grandmother was, always terribly anxious that she would not stand out, that people would not disapprove of her, that she would always be respectable. She was a great gardener, but and they lived in the country. They grew up in London, but they lived in the country for much of the time. And when she had to go and pick somebody up at the local station, she'd get all dressed up because she didn't want the station master to see her in her gardening clothes. I mean, that's what a stickler she was. And we were told the story as children, I think maybe by her or maybe by my grandfather. And it wasn't quite clear whether the story was told as a joke at her expense or as a kind of example. But the story is as follows, that they were invited to some grand dinner party somewhere. And when it was time for dessert, some terrible mistake had been made in the kitchen. And instead of custard in front of her, she had a bowl of mayonnaise. And instead of saying anything, she calmly spooned every bit from the bowl of mayonnaise because she couldn't bear to make a fuss. And this was very much my grandmother. And it's a funny way to end this talk.
Well, we do have to end it. Ian Buruma, thank you very much.